presence at Blackwood Asylum. Ever since I started working as a freelance photographer, I've received all sorts of strange offers, but nothing compares to what I was asked this week. An old acquaintance approached me with an unusual offer to document the interior of an old abandoned asylum, Blackwood Asylum, located deep in Maine. He needed the photos for a mysterious project, and the payment was high enough to make me ignore the uneasy feeling that ran up my spine as soon as I heard the name of the place. Despite the macabre stories surrounding Blackwood, I accepted the job, thinking they were just small-town superstitions. Getting there was like entering another world. The asylum was in an isolated area, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to swallow up the daylight. The building, which must once have been imposing, was now just a shadow of its former self. Broken windows, moss-covered walls, and an oppressive stillness that clung to the air. I had done a bit of research on the place before I went, discovering that, in the 1960s, Blackwood had been the scene of cruel medical experiments and constant abuse. Many of the patients never made it out alive. But despite this dark background, I didn't really believe in ghosts. At least not until then. When I entered, something changed. The air seemed heavier, and an inexplicable chill took hold of me. The smell of mold and rot was almost unbearable, but what really bothered me was the constant feeling of being watched. I started to take some pictures, but the camera seemed heavier with each click, as if the place itself was trying to stop me. And then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper echoing through the empty corridors. I convinced myself that it was just the wind, but deep down, a part of me knew that there was something very wrong in this place. I continued to explore the asylum, trying to ignore the growing feeling of unease that was taking hold of me. Each corridor seemed darker and more cramped than the last, and the temperature gradually dropped, as if I were descending to the bottom of a well. At one point, I stopped in front of a metal door, almost entirely covered in rust, but still locked with a thick padlock. As I approached, I felt a shiver run down my spine, and then I heard it again. That whisper. This time it was louder and clearer, as if someone was right behind me, muttering unintelligible words. I turned around abruptly, but there was no one there. I decided it was time to get out of there. As I hurried back down the corridor, the lights started flashing frantically, as if the place was about to collapse. Suddenly, I heard hurried footsteps, as if someone was running towards me. The sound echoed off the walls, coming faster and faster. My heart raced, and I found myself fighting the instinct to flee, trying to stay calm. But the footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Then the locked door I had passed began to bang violently, as if someone or something desperately wanted to get out. With trembling hands, I grabbed my camera to record what was happening, but the image that appeared on the screen made me freeze. There, at the very end of the corridor, was a figure. A man, or at least the shadow of one, was standing there watching me. His face was indistinct, covered in shadows, but his eyes shone with a palpable hatred. The whispering came again, now from all sides, and I finally gave in to panic. I ran without looking back, hearing the footsteps echoing again, closer and closer, until I made it out of the building, panting and terrified. But even outside, I felt that something was still with me, a presence that wouldn't leave me alone. In the days that followed my visit to Blackwood Asylum, I could no longer sleep properly. Those images, that constant whispering, everything seemed to be impregnated in my mind, as if the asylum had left an invisible mark on me. I began to notice small changes in my house. Objects moved around, doors that I was sure I had closed were open in the morning, and, during the night, I could swear I heard the same hurried footsteps from the asylum resounding in the hallway. I would wake up sweating, gasping for breath, and with the persistent feeling that I was being watched. In an attempt to find some logical explanation, I decided to look for my friend who had given me the job. He seemed surprised to see me, as if he hadn't expected me to return. When I told him what had happened, he just shook his head, warning me that the Blackwood was known for getting with people, that many others who had gone in came out changed, haunted by visions and nightmares. I was furious that I hadn't been warned before, but he simply told me that no one would believe it until they saw it for themselves. His words only served to increase my anguish, as if to confirm that I wasn't crazy, but doomed to something much worse. The worst thing happened when I started to see things even when I was awake. In broad daylight, shadows stretched impossibly long, seeming to follow me wherever I went. Once, while editing the photos I had taken in the asylum, I noticed something strange in one of them. In the corner of the image, reflected in a broken mirror, was the same man I had seen in the corridor. But this time, his face was as clear as day, and I could see the expression of pain and hatred in his empty eyes. The whisper came again, now inside my own head, repeating the same incomprehensible words I had heard that night. And it was then that I understood. He hadn't stayed at the Blackwood. He had come with me. Things became unbearable after I realized he was with me. The man in the photos wasn't just a scary figure trapped in old pictures. He was there, present in my life, a shadow that refused to leave me alone. I heard the whispering all the time, an incessant litany that drove me to the brink of madness. The nights were worse, with that figure appearing in my room, in the corner of my vision, always still, watching but never approaching. The simple act of sleeping became a battle, and soon I was exhausted, physically and mentally. One night I decided to confront him. I couldn't live with that constant terror any longer, and I needed answers, or maybe just a way to end it all. I waited until the whispering came again, until I felt its suffocating presence in the room. Then, in an impulse of desperation, I started screaming, demanding that he show himself, that he explain what he wanted. The lights flickered, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and I could feel the pressure in the air, as if something colossal was about to manifest itself. And it appeared, clearer than ever, standing at the foot of my bed. The man's face was a mixture of agony and fury, and when he finally spoke, his voice was like glass breaking inside my head. He accused me of invading his rest, of bringing up pains that he had endured in life, as one of the patients who died at the cruel hands of the Blackwood doctors. He said he was trapped in that place, but now, thanks to me, he had a chance to free himself, at the cost of my sanity, or perhaps my own life. His words were a decree, and with each syllable I felt my mind fragmenting, as if he were sucking away my will to live. I woke up on the floor of my bedroom, enveloped in an oppressive silence, as if the whole world was holding its breath. My head ached intensely, as if it had been crushed from the inside, and my vision was blurred. But worst of all was the feeling of emptiness, as if something vital had been torn from me during the night. I looked around, expecting to see him there, but there was nothing. The Blackwood man, the spirit I had brought with me, was no longer visible. But I knew he was still there, somehow a part of me. The next few days were a blur of confusion and despair. I tried to get back to my routine, but nothing seemed real. Friends tried to visit me, worried about my condition, but I could barely speak. And at night, when the silence in the house became unbearable, I felt his presence again, now merged with my own shadow. The whisper had become a voice in my head, a constant echo of words I couldn't understand, but which terrified me. The project for which I had photographed Blackwood was cancelled, and the money never came. Not that it would make any difference now. I isolated myself completely, fearing that what had haunted me might start to affect other people. My house became my prison, a place where I knew he was watching me, waiting for the right moment to take complete control. Sometimes I find myself looking in the mirrors, trying to see if it's still me reflected there. But the truth is that I no longer know who I am. All I know is that, somewhere inside me, that man is still there, waiting for his chance to escape into the world of the living, using what's left of my life to do so. The enigma of Coldridge Asylum. I've never been one to believe in ghost stories, but that changed when I visited the Coldridge Asylum in Massachusetts. I'm an investigative journalist, and I've always been interested in abandoned places full of forgotten stories. Coldridge, in particular, caught my attention for a specific reason: mysterious disappearances of people trying to explore the site. The authorities said it was because of the unstable structure which had collapsed in some parts, but there was something else. A feeling of unease that seemed to envelop anyone who dared to approach. When I arrived at the site in the early afternoon, I was greeted by an icy wind that cut like a knife, even in the height of summer. The building, partially overgrown, seemed to watch everyone who approached with a kind of silent malice. The walls, once white, were stained a grayish color, as if time itself had corrupted them. There was an old sign hanging on one side, with the name Coldridge State Asylum almost illegible. I decided that I would begin my investigation there, trying to uncover what really happened in that godforsaken place. I entered through the front door, which creaked loudly, as if protesting my presence. The main hall was large, with the remains of broken furniture scattered everywhere, and the smell of damp and rot was almost suffocating. As I moved forward, trying to ignore the echo of my own footsteps, something caught my eye. In the corner of the lobby, on a table covered in dust, there was a metal box, still locked. Curious, I approached, and as I touched the box, a shiver ran through my body. It was as if something or someone had been watching me ever since I set foot in that place. And it was then that I realized I wasn't alone. I should have left right then and there, but curiosity was greater than fear. I tried to open the box, but it was locked and there was no way of breaking into it without some kind of tool. I decided to keep exploring, thinking that maybe I would find something that could explain what was going on in there. As I moved through the dark corridors, the air seemed heavier and heavier, as if the building itself was alive, breathing hard. The darkness of the abandoned rooms around me was absolute, and even with the flashlight, it seemed that the shadows had a will of their own, sneaking out of the light. It was when I reached a small room which had probably been used as an office that I felt the first clear sign that something was wrong. As I looked around, I noticed a rocking chair that moved slightly, as if someone had just gotten up from it. The soft creak of the wood echoed through the room, making my heart race. I was alone, I was sure of it, but that movement was impossible to ignore. I approached carefully, trying to convince myself that the wind, or perhaps my own imagination, was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. As I watched the chair move, I felt a sudden change in temperature. The air became absurdly cold, as if I had been transported to the middle of a harsh winter. And then the sound of a low, almost imperceptible laugh reached my ears. It was a strangely childish sound, but full of a malice that made me freeze inside. I looked around for the source, but there was nothing but dirty, empty walls. The chair stopped moving, and silence took over again, leaving behind a feeling of alertness, as if I were being watched closely. Something there wanted me to know it was there. After that encounter in the living room, I knew that Coldridge Asylum wasn't just an abandoned building. Something, or someone, was watching me, and I didn't know what to expect next. I continued to explore, increasingly alert to any sign of movement or sound. The walls seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and I felt that every step I took was taking me deeper into a nightmare I wouldn't be able to escape. At one point, as I was crossing a narrow corridor, a nearby door opened by itself with a loud bang, revealing a room that was hidden in the shadows. I hesitated, but entered. It was a small room, perhaps a patient's, with a rusty bed and a filthy mattress. But what caught my eye most was the diary that was lying on the floor, partially hidden under the bed. I picked it up carefully, noticing that the pages were yellowed and worn. Leafing through it, I saw that the notes were from someone called Emily, a young patient who had been admitted to Coldridge against her will. Her words spoke of a man of shadows who appeared in her room every night, whispering promises and threats. She said that he tormented her, but that the doctors didn't believe her, treating her cries for help as delusions. While I was reading, I felt a presence behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one. The room was deserted, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was overwhelming. The diary slipped from my hands when I heard that childish giggle again, now clearer, as if the source was very close. The sound echoed off the walls, seeming to come from every corner at once. The air became even colder, and a slight breeze blew, even though the windows were all closed. It was then that I saw, out of the corner of my eye, a small figure, a child, running down the corridor and disappearing into the darkness. It wasn't a hallucination. Something or someone was playing with me. With every minute that passed inside the asylum, I felt my sanity eroding. The presence of that ghostly child put me on high alert. I decided it was time to leave, but the way back seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if the building was playing with my perception. While trying to find the exit, I passed a large hall that I didn't remember seeing before. The walls were covered in scribbles made with something that looked like blood, and in the center of the hall, there was a wheelchair facing me. There was no avoiding passing by, and something told me that this was exactly what the entity wanted. As I approached the wheelchair, it moved on its own, turning slowly until it was facing me. I stopped, my heart beating fast, as I watched this surreal scene, and then it began to move towards me, as if it were being pushed by invisible hands. At the same time, the walls around me began to vibrate, and the sound of whispering voices filled the room. It was as if the tortured souls of Coleridge were trying to communicate with me, or worse, trying to drag me down to the same dark fate they had. The chair came closer and closer, and I found myself trapped, unable to move. That's when I heard a high-pitched scream from somewhere above me. I looked up and saw the figure of Emily, the young woman from the diary, hanging by her neck from a rope that came out of nowhere. Her eyes were fixed on me, empty but filled with a deep pain. She swayed slightly and her mouth moved, trying to form words that I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the wheelchair stopped and the voices fell silent. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Emily disappeared, and in her place, a gigantic shadow began to form, growing and writhing until it filled almost the entire room. The shadow advanced on me, and all I could do was close my eyes and wait for the end. When I opened my eyes, the hall was empty again. The wheelchair had disappeared, as had the shadow that had almost swallowed me up. I was alone, or so it seemed. The silence was absolute, but now, more than ever, I knew that the asylum was alive, feeding on the fear of those who dared to invade its territory. I wasted no time. I ran through the corridors that seemed to stretch and shorten until I finally found the exit. The cool night air hit me like a punch, but I didn't stop until I reached the car, panting and in a cold sweat. The images of that day remained etched in my mind, but the most disturbing was the diary I had brought with me, without realizing it. At home, when I opened the pages again, I realized that the words had changed. They were no longer Emily's notes, but something that seemed to be a message addressed to me. "You can't escape," the first sentence said, in shaky, irregular handwriting. The diary kept warning me that the Coleridge Asylum was not finished with me, that I had opened a door that could no longer be closed. Each page seemed to pulse with an evil energy, as if Emily herself was trying to communicate from beyond. Since that day, my life has never been the same. Strange little events started happening. Flashing lights, whispers in the dark, the constant feeling of being watched. I tried to get rid of the diary, but it always reappeared somewhere in my house, as if it were attached to me. And then, one night, I heard that childish giggle again, coming from the hallway, just like in the asylum. I knew I wasn't alone. Coleridge had marked me in a way I couldn't understand, and now I was his new prisoner, condemned to live with the shadow of something that should never have been disturbed. The voice in the corridors of the Northgate Sanatorium. I've always been skeptical about the supernatural, but after working for a few months at the Northgate Sanatorium in Virginia, I began to question my convictions. I'm a nurse, and when I was offered a temporary job to cover a shortfall in the nursing staff, I accepted without hesitation. The pay was good, and the location wasn't that far from where I lived. What I didn't know was that Northgate had a sinister reputation, stretching back decades. It was said that the place was haunted, that the voices of former patients still echoed through the corridors at night. My first shift began without much incident. The place was large and quiet, with long, dimly lit corridors. The few patients left there were mostly elderly, abandoned by their families, or people who had nowhere else to go. It was a sad environment, but I was used to dealing with difficult situations. However, I soon realized that there was something else there, something I couldn't explain rationally. It all started with small noises, light footsteps that seemed to follow me as I walked through the corridors. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks, but then I heard it for the first time. A soft, almost whispering voice calling my name. At first, I thought it was one of the patients, lost or in need of help. I followed the voice to an older part of the building, where we hardly ever went. The place was badly looked after, with locked doors and broken windows. But the voice continued, calling out to me, always ahead, guiding me through corridors that seemed endless. When I finally reached the end of the corridor, I came across a heavy metal door, locked with several chains. The voice stopped. I looked around, confused, but the silence that followed was even more disturbing. Something or someone wanted me to be there, but why? I stood in front of that door for a few minutes, trying to understand what had just happened. The voice that had guided me there disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Still, I felt an invisible pressure pushing me to investigate further. I took a flashlight from my pocket and illuminated the surrounding area, noticing that the walls were covered in mold and cracks, as if that part of the hospital had been forgotten for decades. Something seemed very wrong there, but my instinct as a nurse told me that maybe there was someone who needed help on the other side of that door. I decided to try to open the door, even with the chains and padlocks sealing it. The idea that someone could be trapped in there, without anyone knowing, gave me sudden courage. But as soon as I touched the first chain, a shiver ran through my body, and the voice whispered my name again, this time directly into my ear. I jumped back, my heart racing, and turned the flashlight in all directions, but there was no one. The corridor was completely empty, except for me and that ominous door. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, as if several people were hiding in the shadows, watching my every move. Unable to move, I stood there, taking deep breaths, trying to stay calm. But then a low, rhythmic knock began to come from inside the locked room. At first, it was almost imperceptible, but soon it intensified, as if someone was banging on the door with their fists. And then I heard the voice again, now clearer and more desperate, calling for help. I was torn between the urge to run and the need to find out what was going on. With trembling hands, I tried to force the door once more, but the chains wouldn't budge. Something, or someone, was trapped in there, and the only thing I knew was that I wasn't prepared for what was coming next. After that unsuccessful attempt to open the door, I began to hear noises throughout the corridor, as if someone was running around me, but there was no one visible. The sound was disturbing. It seemed to come from everywhere, echoing off the walls as if the whole building was whispering its secrets to me. My hands were sweating, and I felt that at any moment, something horrible was going to happen. I decided to retreat, to go back to the active part of the hospital, where other nurses and patients would be, but before I could take the first step, the metal door began to shake violently. The sound of chains clashing echoed down the corridor as the door seemed to struggle to open. An icy wind blew past me, as if something was moving down the corridor towards me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs seemed paralyzed, trapped by the terror that now dominated every fiber of my being. The voice that had once seemed to whisper softly was now screaming for help, repeating my name in a high-pitched, desperate tone. The sound was almost unbearable, as if it was being shouted directly into my mind, and I found myself pressing my hands against my ears, trying to push it away. It was then that the door finally opened with a bang, throwing the chains to the floor. Inside the room, everything was shrouded in thick darkness, as if the torchlight couldn't penetrate. From the depths of that darkness, a figure began to emerge, an indistinct but clearly human silhouette. The figure seemed to float, moving towards me with an eerie slowness. The air around me became colder, and I finally managed to move, taking shaky steps backwards. I knew I needed to get out of there, but something was stopping me, a morbid curiosity that kept me trapped, wanting to understand what that approaching thing was. When she got closer, I realized that her eyes were shining with an indescribable hatred, and her mouth was moving, repeating my name in a terrifying whisper. I couldn't breathe anymore. Her presence was overwhelming, and the only thing going through my mind was that I was about to meet my death. As the figure came closer and closer, my body was seized by a feeling of absolute panic. I tried to run, but my legs were trapped, as if invisible roots were holding me in place. The darkness around the figure seemed to expand, swallowing up the corridor and everything around me. And then she stopped a few meters from me, her eyes fixed on mine, shining brightly. I felt that if she came any closer, it would be the end of everything. The air seemed to be sucked out of my lungs, and a huge pressure formed in my head, as if something was trying to invade my mind. The figure stretched out a hand towards me, and I could clearly see the outline of long skeletal fingers. It seemed to be calling to me, its incessant murmuring now clearer than ever. "Come to me!" Those words repeated themselves in my mind, like a distorted echo, and I began to feel an inexplicable attraction, an urge to get closer, to follow that order. It was at that moment that I realized that this was not just an ordinary haunting, but something much more dangerous, something that wanted to take me to the depths of the darkness that inhabited that room. Gathering up all the willpower I had left, I managed to take a step backwards, breaking the spell that presence was exerting over me. As soon as I did, the figure let out a high-pitched scream, a sound that wasn't human, and began to move quickly towards me, like a shapeless shadow. Panic overtook me and I finally managed to run. I turned and shot down the corridor without looking back, as the entity's screams echoed throughout the building, reverberating in my ears. The lights flashed frantically, and the feeling that I was being followed intensified by the second. When I finally reached the main lobby, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder, and everything went dark. I woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by co-workers and doctors, all with worried expressions. It took me a few moments to understand where I was and what had happened. One of the doctors told me that they had found me passed out in the lobby of the Northgate Sanatorium, completely pale and unresponsive. I couldn't explain what I saw or felt, but I knew it wasn't just a hallucination. Something inside that building was out to get me, and it almost did. I was discharged a few days later, but the effects of that night were still with me. Nights at home became a real torment, with recurring nightmares and a constant feeling of being watched. The echo of that figure's words, "Come to me," still resonated in my mind, haunting me in every moment of silence. I began to avoid any dark place, and even the sound of footsteps in an empty corridor made me panic. Going back to work was out of the question. I resigned and decided that I would never set foot in an old hospital or nursing home again. A few weeks later, I heard from a former colleague that the Northgate Sanitarium had been closed for renovations, but was in fact being investigated for paranormal activity. Several employees reported seeing things they couldn't explain, and the authorities began looking for a solution to the problem. I felt a sense of relief knowing that I wasn't alone in my experience, but at the same time, the fear that it could still find me remained. And now, even during the day, I can't help but look over my shoulder, hoping that the shadow of that figure will one day return, demanding that I fulfill what it started. The nightmare of Briarcliff Mental Hospital. I've always been fascinated by old stories and forgotten places, but I never thought it would lead me to one of the most terrifying moments of my life. My name is Ethan, and I'm an amateur historian. My hobby is visiting abandoned sites to document the history and legends that surround these places. When I heard about Briarcliff Mental Hospital, an abandoned psychiatric hospital in West Virginia, I became obsessed. The hospital was closed in the 1970s after a series of investigations into inhumane treatment and unexplained deaths of patients. The townspeople avoided the place, claiming it was cursed, but this only increased my curiosity. I arrived at Briarcliff on a cloudy afternoon, when the shadows were beginning to lengthen. The building was imposing, with its ivy-covered red brick walls and broken windows, like empty eyes watching my arrival. The iron gate that once kept the patients isolated from the world was ajar, creaking ominously in the wind. There was a heavy atmosphere in the air, as if the building itself was aware of my presence, waiting to reveal its dark secrets. As I prepared my camera equipment, I tried to push away the growing discomfort, reminding myself that I was only there to record history, not to be part of it. I entered through the main lobby, which still retained some traces of its grandiose past. Marble floors now cracked and covered in dirt, chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, now rusty and covered in cobwebs. The silence was disturbing, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water falling somewhere in the building. I started exploring the corridors, taking photos of the abandoned rooms and trying to imagine what life was like for the patients and staff there decades ago. But I soon realized that I wasn't alone. Footsteps echoed through the corridors, coming closer and then disappearing, as if someone was watching me from a distance, always one step ahead. I felt a shiver run up my spine, but I kept going, determined to find out what else Briarcliff had to offer. As I made my way through the dark corridors of Briarcliff, an uneasy feeling came over me. I tried to concentrate on the photos, but the footsteps that seemed to be following me wouldn't leave me alone. Each time I looked back, I found only emptiness, but the feeling of being watched was persistent. I reached a ward that looked like it had been the infirmary, with rusty stretchers scattered around and medicine cabinets open, as if someone had rushed out. One of the cabinets caught my eye, not because it was different from the others, but because it was completely intact, as if no time had passed for it. As I approached, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar, and inside I saw something that looked like a notebook. I picked up the notebook carefully, feeling the weight of the decades on the yellowed pages. It was a diary, apparently belonging to a nurse called Margaret, who worked there in the last days of the hospital's operation. As I read the first few pages, an inexplicable chill took over the room, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. Margaret's notes talked about the patients, the deplorable conditions they lived in, and the horrors she had witnessed. But what disturbed me most were the last pages, where she reported hearing voices coming from the empty rooms, voices whispering her name, asking for help. She spoke of shadows moving across the walls and a constant feeling of being watched. As I absorbed her words, I felt a presence behind me. The air became heavy, and the sound of slow, deep breathing became audible. I turned around quickly, but again, there was nothing there, just the dark corridor. But now there was something different. One of the doors, which had previously been closed, was slightly open, as if inviting me in. I approached cautiously, feeling my heart beat faster with every step. When I pushed the door, it creaked loudly, revealing a dark and cluttered room. The musty smell was strong, and the air seemed almost solid, as if something invisible was filling the space. At the back of the room, an indistinct shadow moved and a low voice, almost a whisper, called my name. I knew at that moment that something was very wrong and that I was entering dangerous territory. That voice that whispered my name seemed to echo inside my head, leaving me in a state of extreme alert. I entered the room, feeling like I was invading a space that didn't belong to me. The walls were covered in nail marks, as if someone had desperately tried to escape. The bed, which occupied the center of the room, was unmade, the sheets stained with something that looked like old blood. My heart was pounding as I tried to understand what had happened in that place. Then I noticed something written on the wall above the bed. In shaky, almost faded letters, it read, "Don't trust the shadow." Those words made me shudder, but before I could process them, the room was filled with an intense cold, so penetrating that it made me shiver. The door behind me closed with a bang, leaving me trapped in that oppressive environment. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and the flashlight I was holding began to fail, the light flickering frantically. It was then that I noticed something moving in the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. The figure that had previously looked like a dark spot now became clearer, outlining the shape of a tall person with indistinct features. It wasn't possible to see his face, but I could feel his eyes fixed on me. The figure began to approach, sliding across the floor in an almost supernatural way, without making a sound. Dread overtook me, and I found myself backing up until I hit the opposite wall with nowhere to run. The flashlight finally went out, leaving me in complete darkness. And then I heard the voice again, now clearer and more desperate. "You shouldn't be here." The words echoed through the room, as if coming from all directions at once. I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder, and a scream of pure terror escaped my throat. The figure was right in front of me now, and all I could think was that I had to get out of there before it was too late. The moment that icy hand touched my shoulder, a primal fear gripped me. The presence in front of me was overwhelming, as if all the air in the room had been sucked out. I knew I had to get out of there, but my legs felt frozen, unable to move. The voice, now more intense, repeated the same words, warning me that I shouldn't be there. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. All I could do was feel the weight of that darkness enveloping me, a suffocating sensation that told me something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, the door behind me opened with a bang, as if someone had broken it down. The dim light from the corridor flooded into the room, dispelling the shadows that surrounded me. I seized the opportunity and ran, without looking back, feeling an icy presence chasing me. The corridors of Briarcliff seemed like an endless maze. The walls seemed to close in around me as I ran desperately. Every corner I turned, I heard rapid footsteps behind me, accompanied by that insistent whisper, repeating my name. I was being hunted by something that didn't belong in this world. Finally, I reached the main lobby, panting and with my heart racing. The entrance doors, which had once seemed so far away, were now in front of me, ajar, like a last chance to escape. Without hesitation, I ran towards the exit, feeling the cold wind outside envelop me as I crossed the threshold. When I finally left the building, I stumbled and fell to my knees on the damp ground. I looked back, expecting to see that shadowy figure following me, but Briarcliff's doors closed with a bang, as if the building itself was throwing me out. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by my gasping for breath. I had escaped, but I knew that something inside that place had marked me forever. After that day, I never went back to Briarcliff. The few photos I managed to take were blurry, as if the very darkness of the place had swallowed up the image. I've tried to forget what happened, but the memories of that shadowy figure and the whispering voices continue to haunt me. Whenever I close my eyes, I see the dark room, the approaching shadow, and feel an icy hand on my shoulder. It's as if something from that place is still with me, waiting for the right moment to manifest itself again. I went back to my normal life, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Sometimes during the night, I hear footsteps in the hallway of my house, similar to the ones I heard in that hospital. I wake up in a cold sweat, certain that something is watching me. I've tried to convince myself that it was just the trauma of the experience, but deep down I know that Briarcliff left a mark on me, something I can never erase. Now I avoid abandoned places and ghost stories. The price for my curiosity was too high, and I'm not willing to pay it again. But worst of all is the silence that follows the nights I wake up scared. A heavy silence, as if the whole world is waiting, just as I am, for something to finally reveal itself. And when I look at my reflection in the mirror, I sometimes see a shadow that shouldn't be there, a constant reminder that Briarcliff's nightmare never really ended. It just changed scenery. The mystery of Ravenswood Asylum. My name is Emma, and I'm a psychology student who has always been fascinated by the darker side of the human mind. When I heard about Ravenswood Asylum in Ohio, an abandoned psychiatric hospital famous for its controversial practices and haunting stories, I felt I had to investigate. Ravenswood was closed in the 1980s after a series of scandals involving brutal treatment and unexplained disappearances of patients. The local community considered the place cursed, and few dared to go near it. But for me, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to study the impact of isolation and trauma in an environment so laden with dark stories. I arrived at the asylum on a cloudy evening, with the sky tinged with gray and the air heavy, foreshadowing a storm. The building, imposing and decaying, was surrounded by a rusty fence, and the main gate was sagging, as if someone had forced it in or out. The structure itself was a Gothic masterpiece, with tall towers and windows that seemed to look down on intruders. As I approached the entrance, a cold wind blew, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and something else, something I couldn't identify, but which caused me immediate discomfort. I entered the main lobby, where the tiled floor was cracked and covered in debris. The silence inside was almost palpable, as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. I began to explore, passing abandoned treatment rooms, narrow, claustrophobic corridors, and rooms that once housed lost souls. There was a strange energy in the air, as if the walls were impregnated with the pain and despair of those who had lived there. In every corner, I felt a presence, something that seemed to be watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It was in this oppressive atmosphere that I decided to go down to the basement, where old archives and forgotten documents could hold Ravenswood's darkest secrets. Descending into the basement of Ravenswood Asylum was like diving into another world. The stairs were narrow and steep, with concrete steps that seemed to crumble with every step. The air became denser and more humid as I descended, carrying a strong smell of mold and something more unpleasant, a mixture of rot and rust. When I finally reached the basement, the flashlight could barely illuminate the vastness of the space in front of me. Shadows stretched into every corner, creating indistinct shapes that seemed to move as I walked. I started looking through the archives, hoping to find some patient records or notes from the doctors who worked there. The shelves were full of old boxes and dusty folders, many of them already falling apart due to time and humidity. In a far corner, I found a locked metal cabinet. Forcing the rusty lock, I managed to open it, revealing a collection of notebooks and files. As I leafed through one of the notebooks, something caught my eye. It was the diary of one of the head doctors, who reported on the experiments carried out on patients suffering from severe mental disorders. His words were cold and distant, describing cruel procedures as if they were routine. It was then that I felt a presence behind me. The air suddenly became colder, and the flashlight began to fail, flickering as the shadows around me seemed to close in. I heard a low rumble, a whisper that turned into a voice that was soft but filled with a deep sadness. "Why did you come here?" The voice seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing off the damp basement walls. I turned around quickly, lighting up the space around me, but there was no one there. However, the feeling of being watched was intense, as if something or someone was there with me, hiding in the shadows, studying me. My heart raced, and a primitive instinct told me that I needed to get out of there immediately. Although my instinct screamed at me to get out of the basement, something kept me there, a mixture of fascination and fear. I continued leafing through the doctor's diary, but the words began to jumble before my eyes, as if the story itself was distorting. The voice came again, now clearer and closer, repeating the same question. "Why did you come here?" Each syllable was charged with pain, as if the spirit behind the voice was trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. My hands trembled as I held the notebook, and the flashlight, which could barely keep the light steady, revealed something that made my blood run cold. In the darkest corner of the basement, the shadows seemed to contort, gaining shape and density. Little by little, an indistinct figure emerged from the darkness. A tall, thin silhouette with features that resembled a human being, but distorted, as if something had corrupted its form. The face was an indistinct blur, but the eyes shone with a dim, bluish light that seemed to pierce my soul. I was paralyzed, unable to look away, as the figure moved slowly towards me, as if it were sliding across the floor. The voice continued, now almost in a wailing tone, asking repeatedly, "Why did you come all this way?" Suddenly, the figure stopped, and the atmosphere around me became even colder. I felt an intense shiver run up my spine, as if an invisible hand was touching the back of my neck. The diary slipped out of my hands, falling to the floor with a deafening sound that echoed through the basement. The figure remained still, but the sense of danger was overwhelming, as if it was waiting for something from me, a response I didn't know how to give. Gasping for breath, I took a step back, trying to gather the courage to move. But before I could react, the figure dissolved into the darkness, disappearing as silently as it had appeared, leaving behind only the question that now echoed in my mind. "Why did you come here?" After the figure disappeared, the silence in the basement became deafening. The echo of the question, "Why did you come down here?" still reverberated in my mind, as if the very darkness of the place had adopted those words. My breathing was heavy, and the cold that was once just a nuisance now seemed to penetrate to the bone. I knew I needed to get out of there, but something was stopping me from simply running. I felt as if there was something else, something I hadn't discovered yet, a truth hidden in the shadows that I needed to understand. I picked up the diary that had fallen to the floor, but now the pages were blank. I flipped through it quickly, looking for the notes I had just read, but it was as if the contents had been erased. I felt a growing despair, as if Ravenswood himself was playing with my sanity. It was then that I heard the voice again, but this time it wasn't whispering. It was a high-pitched scream, full of pain and despair, which reverberated through the basement walls, making my heart leap. The shadows around me began to move again, writhing unnaturally, as if the building itself were alive. The shadowy figure returned, emerging from the corner of the basement with frightening speed. It was closer, and this time I could feel an overwhelming presence, as if the air around it was vibrating with an evil energy. The voice, now coming directly from the figure, repeated the question, but with a tone that demanded an answer. "Why did you come here?" I had no answer, but my body reacted before my mind could process it. I ran through the basement, up the stairs as fast as I could without looking back. The sound of my footsteps echoed like gunshots, and I could feel the figure following me, a presence that seemed to want to drag me back into the darkness. When I finally reached the exit, I pushed open the door with all my strength and stumbled out, panting and panicked. The sky outside was dark. The storm had finally begun, with thunder roaring and torrential rain falling. But at that moment, the rain was a relief. I was out of Ravenswood, but I knew something had changed. The shout and the question still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that that figure was still with me, waiting for the answer I didn't have. After leaving Ravenswood Asylum, I drove for hours, trying to shake off the fear and the feeling that I was being followed. When I finally got home, I hoped to find some relief, but the anguish only increased. I spent the next few days in seclusion, unable to concentrate on anything other than the experience in the basement. That voice, that incessant question, "Why did you come here?" kept echoing in my thoughts, haunting me with every moment of silence. I tried to tell some friends about what had happened, but they looked at me skeptically, suggesting that perhaps the frightening atmosphere had played tricks on my mind. The worst, however, were the nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I relived the moment when the shadowy figure emerged from the shadows, felt the chill that accompanied it, and heard the voice that seemed to come from everywhere. I went to sleep with the light on, but even so, I had the feeling that something was moving in the corners of my room, always out of sight. I tried to focus on my studies, but my obsession with Ravenswood took over. I mentally revisited every detail of that place, trying to understand what had happened and why that figure seemed so determined to confront me. Finally, I decided that I couldn't go on like this any longer. Going back to Ravenswood was out of the question, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something there was still calling me. I began to have nightmares in which I returned to the basement, and each time the shadowy figure came closer, its presence becoming more and more oppressive. I felt that if I didn't find a way to answer the question it was asking me, something terrible would happen. But how could I answer a question that I myself didn't understand? Now, every shadow I see, every whisper I hear in the dark, reminds me that Ravenswood isn't finished with me. Something from that night continues to haunt me, like a curse I can't break.